Hello. So we've spent 3 days altogether, well, 3 tours, 3 hours in this Art Nouveau gorgeous palace. Well, it's not even a house, it is a palace of David Sarajishvili. So let me give you a very quick recap of what building we are talking about. So I'm going to be switching off the chat. Hi, Maria. There you go. So that's the house I'm talking about in Salalaki neighborhood, Salalaki again, because there is so much more to see. A second. Yeah. This is David Sarajishvili, the founder of the brandy making, brandy industry in the Russian Empire and Georgia and way beyond Georgia. Also, he was a philanthropist and one of the most generous donors in Georgia's history. Maybe even, I don't know, maybe even the entire, well, definitely Caucasus, but also maybe even just as big as some of the Russian donors of the early 20th century. So approximately the same time. Really big deal. And I mean, just the look of the house, just the way it looks, it also speaks a lot for itself, I think. So a very rich man. Yes, he was not, he was born also into a rich family. Yes, this is true. So he definitely was not coming from the underprivileged class, but he all his entire life he tried to help the people in need, and he also nourished the talents. He with his wife Ekaterina Parakashvili didn't have children on their own, so I guess they just saw their mission in kind of taking care and raising the young talents of Georgia, mainly writers and poets. But not only that, obviously. This house was always full of, there were all constantly some dinners held, discussions, performances, and so on. Well, this has always been very upscale neighborhood. That is true. After David Sarajishvili passed away, his wife took over the business, and she even managed to multiply the wealth. When she later on sold the house to another merchant, Akaki Kashtaria. I'll show you the photos. To see some of the exhibitions, we need to go upstairs, so we're taking this staircase. But we've already spoken about this staircase. We've already seen the staircase. It's just a little recap. Don't think that we're going to go explore these rooms just once again. No, we're not going to do that. And things were going okay up until, in 1970, when the Russian Empire collapsed. Things got even better in many ways because Georgia finally could enjoy its independence. And it just happened so that Akaki Kashtaria was involved. He was a businessman, and this is him, Akaki Kashtaria. He was involved in a lot of like international businesses. He established a lot of international connections, and eventually even he rented out this house to the British embassy. And the British forces were quartered in Tbilisi and in Georgia and in Batumi because they kind of guaranteed Georgia's independence. That Georgia would not be uh, invaded by the Soviets, and it wasn't invaded until 1921. And while the British were housed in were housed there. Yeah. By the way, this is the photograph taken in the backyard. That's members of the bank that was ran by Akaki Kosharia, and all the businessmen, like some of the biggest businessmen of the Caucasus, including the oil money, right, including also British ambassador wardrobe. So this building was the center of the British forces in Transcaucasia. So this entire street was always full of police and the British officers. So John Oliver Wardrobe, who was a big specialist in Kartvelian studies, in Kartvelian literature. So he was the diplomat. He lived in this house. He worked in this balcony. And so he enjoyed that up until 1921. And then in 1921, things started to go south for the independent Georgia, and the British had left. And eventually, on February 25, 1921, the Red Army invaded Tbilisi. And the striking thing to many Georgians is still up to this day. I have talked to so many Georgians about it. You know how I've been studying, the Russian Revolution. It's a very important topic to me. Well, it's also interesting how the Russian Revolution affected Georgia. Well, it didn't really have this immediate effect because Georgia actually enjoyed, the collapse of the Russian Empire because they were able to build something on their own. But then it was abruptly finished by the Soviets. So a lot of Georgians, I'm so sorry, I just need to rearrange a few things here. So about 60% of everyone who was involved in the takeover of the government or the takeover of power from the democratic government, Republican government, were actually Georgians. 60% were Georgians. That's a big deal. This is the photograph taken in 1921. So the Red Army Caucasus Front headquarters. So the Caucasus Front, the people, Sergo Orджоникидзе, sorry, Sergo Orджоникидze. We will be hearing this name today multiple times. Clearly, clearly a Georgian name, and we know of several more names. I'm not even including here. Obviously, it's not even about Stalin yet. After the hold on a second. I wonder if my internet. Okay, wait a sec. I think my trying to see why I cannot. Yeah, okay. So it should be okay now. Yeah, looks like it's fine. So I can go on. So as I was talking about, a lot of them were Georgians, and Sergei Orджоникидзе was one of those who totally who arranged the takeover, and a lot of people were actually functioning from within the country, from within Tbilisi even. Obviously, they were hiding, they worked on the cover up. A lot of politicians actually, well, uh, pretended kind of being neutral, but that actually was not the case at all. We'll be talking a lot about Sergei Orджоникидзе today. I will be mentioning him many more times. So eventually, this is, by the way, from the New York Times, 20th of February 1921. Red Army effects junction. What is that? Okay, with Kemal's troops after overrunning the Republic. So crushed Georgia, joined with Turks. Soviets set up in Tiflis. Capital might be used as a base for invasion of Persia. Americans safe so far. I like every word here. there's like so much here, a lot of international conflicts involved. So the First World War, um, first and foremost, is the First World War, Russian Civil War, also the smaller, already after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the survival of Turkey, of what's left of the Ottoman Empire, and then conflicts with in Persia, obviously, and always Americans involved. There's just so many things in just one tiny Georgia was kind of in the eye of the storm. So I like this newspaper cutout. Americans safe so far. I like it. I really like it. So, yeah. So in that conflict, Americans were really safe. Um, Red Army commandos in Batum in March. So having Batum in control and not letting the former Ottomans and the Turks under Mustafa Kemal, just making sure they don't enter was also one of the very big ideas. And there were several fronts, several regiments. I'm not giving the tour of how Georgia was invaded. No, God forbid. I don't want to do a tour of that. But I'm kind of giving that it was a well planned, very well structured and organized event that took place in multiple corners of the country. And it was pretty swift. There were battles. Yes, there were battles. People were killed. True. They were really ruthless. So the Bolsheviks were ruthless, but it went quite smooth, I would say. Sorry, that was too fast. So because the British had been there before, so obviously the Bolsheviks also had to fight that. And so these tanks were seized by the Red Army in the course of the Civil War. And well, this is like, what kind of the Soviets enjoyed having all those foreign intervention contributions. Yeah, just a British tank that was left and seized by the Bolsheviks. So Sergei was in charge of the whole operation. He reported directly to Lenin. He reported directly to Stalin as well, and further on would be reporting to Stalin for some time until he would be killed himself. So Sergei was a Georgian, and there were a lot of fellow Georgians that happily arranged that takeover. Happily. Well, Sergei this is actually the telegram that he sent to Lenin and Stalin, saying the red flag of Soviet power flies over Tiflis, National Archives of Georgia. That's what Lenin had been wanting to hear. Lenin was actually torn. So when the Russian Empire collapsed, Lenin, didn't want the empire to actually fall apart. He just wanted to remake this empire, but he still wanted Georgia to remain within the empire. But he just knew he couldn't do everything. Like he couldn't do all at once, unfortunately. And he just realized he had to wait. He had to hold his horses with regards to Georgia because there were far bigger issues, such as the civil war in Russia proper, that they still needed to fight, that they still needed to win. Yes, so that's Sergei. So eventually, when the Bolsheviks invaded, with so many Georgians being in charge of the whole, takeover, the Georgian writers, when the Bolsheviks came to this house, which happened almost immediately. So the Paulishvili, the poet who we have been talking about before, we even walked down his street named after him because he happened to live in that street. So Paulishvili knew a lot of those Bolsheviks in person. And because actually many of them originally were anti-monarchists, and they first and foremost tried to fight for the abolition of monarchy, which they thought would automatically grant Georgia independence. Little did they know, but yes, it did happen so, but not for long, as you see. So Paulishvili spoke Georgian to those kind of invaders, right? And he spoke in person with Orjonikidze because Orjonikidze was in charge of everything, reported directly to Lenin and Stalin. And he explained to Orjonikidze that, well, this organization had nothing to do with politics. It was just writers of Georgia striving to preserve the language, national identity, and the educational level of the people. Orjonikidze saw it with great favor. However, he and several other people, and then also Lavrenti Beria, who also further on would report to Stalin when so Orjonikidze was the first, and after Orjonikidze, it was Lavrenti Beria who would report directly to Moscow and would be the representative of the Moscow authorities just in Georgia. So this is a small document that officially allowed the Writers' Union of Georgia to use this house, to be quartered in this house, in the Sarajishvili house. And for the first year, they didn't even need to pay for any facility because, well, it was the arrangement, but only for 1 year. Next year, well, in a year, they would have to be paying. But that was not the point. The point was that both Orjonikidze and several other people in the administration. I'm so sorry. After very salty cheese, I need to get some more water. So you just need to walk with me to the kitchen to get some water. But that's okay. I can just carry on talking about Lavrenti Beria. Multiple times, the Auliashvili and other writers were absolutely straightforwardly told that any anti-Bolshevik activity, any anti-Bolshevik propaganda, any counter-revolution efforts would immediately result in complete termination of the activity of the House of the Union of Writers, and also would be brutally confronted, and people would be punished severely. Because these people, Lavrenti Beria, Sergei Orjonikidze, were really highly educated men, and they knew the power of literature, right? The power of writers. So they wanted to be friends with the writers because they wanted them to, because literature was one of the propaganda tools. Obviously, they wanted to be friends with them. And that's why they allowed the writers to stay in this gorgeous house. However, it could have been used as the headquarters, by Lavrenti Beria. Lavrenti Beria eventually settled like 2 houses away from the writer's house. 2 buildings away from the writer's house. I'll turn off the sound. So there is a museum of repressed writers. I would say that, there's nothing written there in Russian, obviously, only in Georgian, and some English translation, or just some sort of explanations. And it took me a while, to be honest, to put everything together. And I am not a specialist on Georgian literature. I don't even speak Georgian, so how can I actually, give a talk about Georgian literature if I can't even read this literature in the original language? So, but it's not a tour about the Georgian literature. It's the tour about how Georgian writers survived in the tumultuous times, which I can relate. I mean, well, we know what it was like in Russia proper. So why should it be very different, from what it was? It was not. So, and everything. So end of February, the invasion took place, and already in April 1921, there was a memorial service for the fighters who defended Tbilisi, defended Georgia, but all in vain. Well, those were the battles when the Red Army invaded. And after the ceremony, the Josep Chedilishvili, who was a poet, I have never read anything by him, to be honest. Well, he actually read his own poem commemorating, praising those fighters, which wasn't liked, obviously, by Orjonikidze. And Josep obviously was immediately arrested and the persecution started. So this was the start. They didn't wait a minute. They didn't wait a moment, you know, in, well, kind of trying to fight counter-revolutionary activity. Shalva Eliava was a Georgian. He knew everyone in Tbilisi. Many of those Bolsheviks, many of those, it's an interesting idea. It's just an interesting how it works. Many of those Bolsheviks originally were just anti-monarchists, and they fought hand in hand, not just with Stalin, let's say, and people like Stalin, right? Just for the abolition of monarchy, but they worked closely hand in hand with the government of the independent Georgian Republic, which unfortunately, once the Bolsheviks invaded, had to flee. It was dispersed and had to flee to Europe. So many of those people, they started off in the same way, in the same position, and then at some point things went completely different directions. That's interesting. So the Shalva Eliava, he would be in charge of the propaganda. He would be closely working and keeping an eye on written sources, on propaganda, and on, let's say, in every written outlet in Georgia. He obviously spoke Georgian, which was absolutely essential. He worked closely with other fellow Bolsheviks, and he was merciless with regards to persecuting fellow Georgians, his former friends, his former neighbors and peers. He was totally okay with that. We saw this photo already. So this is Eliava was also part of the Batumi operation. So Eliava was a big fighter. He was respected by Lenin. He was respected by Stalin. Also reported to Orjonikidze. He kept an iron fist upon every writer, and he threatened with violence, any attempts to promote what didn't align with the policy of the party. That's how it was. 1923, obviously, it doesn't mean that from 1921 to 1923, nothing was going on and things were okay. Obviously not. Every year there would be several instances, people being arrested because, well, even though the writers were explained, like very, I would say, openly explained what would happen, what the repercussions would be, they still kept on writing. They still kept on criticizing the Bolsheviks. And obviously, one after another would be persecuted, one after another will be put into jail, and many would not even be coming back from the jail. Like that. So what we see here is the Silvestro Remenidze statement of protest to the vote of Cheka. So Silvestro Remenidze, with his photograph we saw just here. Let me show it to you again. So he wrote a letter, an open letter to the Cheka, to the extraordinary committee that was, this body was arranged, and its main mission was to fight counter-revolution forces and any sort of counter-revolution activity. So Cheka was in charge of all those death penalties. Cheka was in charge of terminating anything that well didn't align with the party. Obviously, he was arrested, and obviously, uh, this would be the end for his career and further on his life. So, but yes, the thing is that Georgians, well, for Georgians, the truth and being true to yourself meant uh, well, just too much. You say even much. It mattered even more than just their own comfort and safety. That's just unfortunately how it was. And there were reports on that. You see, it was typed with a typewriter. It says the indictment of the Emergency Commission of the Georgian SSR, so Chika, on David Kopalishvili. David Kopalishvili, we should see his portrait. So he confronted Sergei Orджоникидзе. David Kopalishvili also published several works that were criticizing the Bolshevik power. And so this type of literature would not be published, and printed and published all around the city. It would be, kind of distributed under the counter. But yet, obviously, eventually, it all became known to Orджоникидзе and everyone else. So Sergei Orджоникидзе was absolutely, he so read once he read what David Kopalishvili wrote, and eventually David Kopalishvili was arrested and killed. There were also other people. There were women too, by the way. Well, Safo Mgiladze, she was a poet. I have never read anything of Safo Mgiladze. She wrote a poem which didn't even name names, and in that poem, you couldn't even well, so as you read that, you couldn't even understand if she was referring to the 1920s event. The thing is that her poems, what a lot of actually writers came up with some sort of a trick like that. They would date their poems 1917, 1916, 1918, in order to make it seem that those would be anti-monarchy poems, but they were not. And Safo Mgiladze just didn't get away with it. So eventually she was also arrested. And yeah, but anyway, so Safo Mgiladze, that's her. A young woman perished, unfortunately, at a very young age. Or, for example, Yosef Grishashvili, a big scientist, by the way, historian, and also a writer. He was in his 20s when he was arrested. It wasn't even anti-Soviet, but it was some criticism. For that, he was arrested and then executed. This type, however, there were a lot of different literature clubs, writers' clubs that functioned within the Union of Writers and Poets of Georgia. Well, there were different styles that were used. And it was a very prolific organization, to be honest. A lot of writers complied. A lot of writers were very successful and received the entire recognition from the entire union. One of the books, for example, this one, it's opened it's in Georgian, so there's no really need. There's no need to read anything even. But hey, it's just enough to have a look at the picture. So in the picture, this is Joseph Stalin. Do you recognize the man in holding something in his hand? I'm not sure if it's a candle or no. I'm not sure. Sorry. And so this type of literature was very successful. So Stalin's biographies, the way Stalin came to power, obviously it was all censored, it was all polished, it was all refined, and there was very little truth to it, actually. That's what we know now. Obviously, we didn't know it then. So those kind of books were very much okay. Well, and then everything else, not really. Then in 1924, which would be a very important year to Georgian writers, a big uprisal started. It's referred to as August Uprising, and it was another attempt of anti-Bolshevik community, anti-Bolshevik forces to combat the Bolshevik rule and reinstate the Georgian Independent Republic. Well, it was a very well planned series of attacks taking place in various regions of Georgia. And from the beginning, actually, it was really successful. It was just mainly the series of ambush operations where they acted unexpectedly and the army was not really prepared I mean, the Bolsheviks army was not really prepared for it, but the Bolsheviks were very quick to find a solution, and eventually they were able to suppress all the uprisals with even more tremendous level of violence and brutality, um, just running the public executions and executing people, shooting people without even without giving it extra time, without any second thoughts, and that was good enough to scare people. That's what you need. You just need to kill one person, and then 100 would be scared. But despite that, yes, this is when, so only 3 years later, the writers understood that it wouldn't really be a good idea if they continued their anti-Bolshevik activity so openly, and eventually they just kind of decided to go undercover. Well, this is interesting. It's a copy of a correspondence card by Lavrenti Beria, who was the deputy chairman of the head of the Secret Operations Division in Georgia and Cheka. So basically, well, Stalin was kind of in charge of everything, and Cheka reported to Stalin directly. So Lavrenti Beria reported directly to Stalin, and Lavrenti Beria was kind of the first person in the country, like the most important person in the country. So regarding the imprisoned writers, Shalva Sharashidze, Konstantin Gamsahurdia, Vasil Chokolashvili, and also Erodion Sogulashvili, October 1924. Still, because the Bolsheviks kept an eye, they were very vigilant. So they were able maybe randomly, maybe they knew, maybe they would they would be picking people, they would be placing them into prison, and then their fate would be just completely in the hands of Beria. That's just how it was. There were several organizations. Also here I'm showing you the photographs, of some people whose stories I find interesting. There were several organizations that functioned alongside the so let's say during the day, these writers would write what the party wanted them to write, but then during the night, like undercover, they would be out there writing some anti-Bolshevik pieces. These people still continued no matter what. And as I told you, it's like they never gave it a second thought. Whenever they thought that someone was involved in some sort of plotting anti-Bolshevik uh, coup or something, these people would be executed just point blank, just like that. Um, a lot of writers would be every once in a while called to check up just some sort of conversations, and they couldn't say no, obviously. So where would all those imprisoned writers be kept? They would be kept exactly in this building, and this is the beginning of the city, right? The Meteki Cliff. That's exactly where the city was founded, right? You remember that story? I'm not even going into much detail about it, but there later on, after Vakhtang Gorgasali proclaimed, officially announced the establishment of the city. Shortly, he built his palace there and the church, and the palace, of course, will be rebuilt several times, but eventually, so it remained a big city palace that belonged to the royal family, and it was on the top of the cliff. So this is the old photograph before the road would be constructed, before the old city would be restructured along the flow of the Mtkvari River. That's the Kura of Mtkvari River that we know very well. And this is the photograph I took. This is the model of the Meteki Cliff and the Meteki Castle. You see, well, it's a palace, but it looks more like a castle, like really impregnable. And in the early Soviet period, that castle or palace that was used as a political prison. Obviously, it was all uh, top secret, but every night people living in the vicinity could hear gunshots, moaning, screams, yelling, people begging, and cries, and just, people crying for life every day. Also, in the later Soviet period, before taking down the building, people who, I guess those were the people who were in charge of probably preparing the whole ensemble for the destruction. Well, I mean the official sanctioned, tearing down the building. They did it actually very quickly. The whole operation took them about a month or so to completely eliminate this building. So people saw inscriptions, like etchings on the walls. Those were solitary confinement rooms. In political prison, they want you to atone for, thinking the wrong way. That was an issue. That was the issue, and people were just going nuts, just there being all alone. But they wouldn't be kept there for too long, to be honest, because in Georgia they were very quick to execute people, just like that. So now it's just kind of a reminder. I think I did tell you about this before on some of my tours. So, but this is where all those writers would be kept in. So starting from like 1924, the Cheka was extra vigilant. There were a lot of, like really a lot of different organizations, a lot of different literature clubs would be established. And there always would be the official list of instructions of what exactly Georgian and Russian literature had to be about. Well, for example, we don't need just intellectuals and Georgian patriots. We want truly Soviet writers and intellectuals. Therefore, I demand the expulsion of comrades who are incorrigible, incorrigible. Those who have not been he healed during these 10 years? Okay, and he had to comply. Otherwise, you wouldn't have anything at all. So, and in the Soviet times, one needs to remember that if you were not a member, if you are not a member of a literature club, of a writers union, and certain organizations, okay, or organizations like affiliated or associated with the writers union, you are not paid salary, you do not have any benefits, nothing. Who was Grigol Rabakidze? Grigol Rabakidze was actually a writer who belonged to one of those literature clubs that were established. It was a pretty big club. It's called Blue Horns. Actually, Blue Horns, it was kind of a community of intellectual, very European, avant-garde writers. Also, well, with a lot of symbolism as well. It's a caricature about the Blue Horns. I recognize this person to the left. That's actually Paolo Yashvili. Paolo Yashvili was also the member of this Blue Horns Literature Club. Yeah, and Nikolai Sesishvili was another man on that flying on that horn. So Grigol Rabakidze, whose photo I just showed you before, I know a lot of new names. You don't really need to follow this much with regard to the names, but I'll just show you the photograph again. Grigol Rabakidze, that's Grigol Rabakidze, was considered a very good writer, especially for children. And he was well respected. He earned a very good reputation. And he was even allowed to travel to Europe for a business trip. And he decided he defected. He stayed in Europe. And the thing is that it already cast a shade on the entire Blue Horns community. Just that, just defecting from the Soviet Union and telling, how harsh the conditions under the Soviets were, and many other things. And Grigol Rabakidze obviously united with the government, well, with the Republican government in exile, obviously. And well, immediately the aftermath came immediately. So hold on a second, I'll show you again. I know there are a lot of new names, and these names are not exactly very easy to follow because they're long Georgian names. I know they sound like tongue twisters to you. Even to me, they sound a little bit like tongue twisters, to be honest. But don't get me wrong, right? But it's just not easy to keep it all in mind and just kind of follow, right? So the Nikolai Tsisishvili was the very first victim of the persecution. He was asked to denounce on the fellow member of the Blue Horns, on Grigol Rabakidze and several others. And eventually he did, because he was tortured. Cheka was known for heavy tortures. Cheka was known for actually, resorting to all means, to all measures that would allow them to to reach the goals that they set for themselves, to get rid of anyone unreliable. And Paolo Yashvili, whom you already know very well, he was also a member of the Blue Horns, and he saw nearly every week there were held meetings with the representatives of the Cheka and the fellow Georgian writers in the writers' house. And in these committees were discussed those issues, like fellow writers were asked to publicly denounce, to publicly criticize their colleagues And Pauliashvili was asked to do the same, but he could not. But he was pressed really heavily. A lot of his friends were arrested, and he saw those arrests, and he knew that if he knew if he didn't denounce on his friend, he would be the next one to be arrested, and then his friends would have to denounce on him. So on July 22nd, 1937, Pauliashvili committed a suicide in this very place during the session of the Writers' Union, at which he was asked to denounce on his fellow writer. That was a big deal. However, that didn't stop Bolsheviks. They actually said, well, you see what happens to all these, public enemies, to those enemies of the working people. So he probably knew he had been guilty. And you know what? A lot of this, by the way, these effigies, they are here from the Soviet times. I might have showed it to you in one of the previous books, but I just, kind of showed it to you once again. So in the Soviet times, for some reason, here were kept these two effigies, and there were some other items kept in the Soviet times. However, it still remained just, well, they're the Writers' House institution. Yes. So, people would be arrested, people would be questioned, tortured, and under tortures, they would just give in. And they'll start, giving away the secrets, or they'll start even inventing the stories because they just simply could not tolerate that anymore. So Pauliashvili just didn't want this to happen. But day after day, his friends, one after another, would start missing. And then Pauliashvili committed the suicide in this very house, in this very walls, and this would only continue. Well, it's written here. I'm just going to give you a little bit of, I'll just read a little bit of that. Writers continued to be imprisoned throughout 1937 and 1938, accused of subversion, sabotage, terrorism, and membership of the Trotskyist nationalist organizations. Well, Trotskyist, it refers to Leon Trotsky, obviously. We're talking here of the times of the purge, right? When Lenin completely went off the rails and started getting rid of the people that used to be actually, on the same side with him. But we know that story. We're not getting there. And you will see a lot of photographs. This is this is actually the copy of the actual photograph. So someone would be just deleting people, deleting their faces, cutting out their faces from group photos, because people were so scared. They did not want to be associated with those public enemies. This feels so scary. This is the actual, but it is the copy of the photograph that actually existed. So somebody did that. People just didn't want to have anything to do with that because, well, the thing is that these writers didn't really need to do anything. They could be just staying in Tbilisi and writing their propaganda, poems or children's stories. But some of them, like 10 years ago, traveled to Europe and possibly, allegedly, established connections with anti-Bolshevik counter-revolutionary organizations. So that would count as espionage. And again, as I said, they didn't even need an excuse. And also, anyone could report on you. Anyone could just, denounce on you. Okay, so just kind of giving you a little bit of quotes, for the presidiums in one of the writers' unions. I like the one to the right by David Demetradze. So fellow writers write, denouncing on others. Tatarashvili has been exposed as an enemy of the people, a diversionist who for many years was engaged in undercover espionage and wrecking activities in various areas of our economic and cultural construction work. He also revealed himself in our union to be an incorrigible bureaucrat. Huh? But people were scared to death. Who are we to condemn them? Who are we to judge them? Those were horrible times, you know? Maybe even at those times, this old phrase, the homus homini lupus est, which you can translate from Latin as a human being to another human being, it was a wolf. Those probably were those times. So who are we to judge? We never lived in those times. You probably can't even imagine that happening, especially those grown up with the Western mindset. But people from the former U.S., from the Soviet Union, let's say, or like kind of, well, the let's say from the Baltic region, they understand it. They know how it works. So this is the photograph of the members of the Blue Horns community. Well, the Writers Union, Blue Horns. The second man to the left with a, I don't know, it's not a bow tie, but like a very short tie with a cap is Pavliashvili. Next to him, his good friend Tizian Tabidze. And then Pavliashvili killed himself, right? And he was the enemy of the people, so his face had to be disguised because people didn't want to be associated with him. That was the thing. And then a little later, by the way, Tizian Tabidze, his friend, would be also arrested and executed. So another session of Georgian Writers Union Presidium. All speakers were unanimous in their harsh repudiation and condemnation of the treacherous work of Pavliashvili. His direct links to sworn enemies of the Soviet people, his participation in their murky activities, his suicide at the Writers' Palace, a wholly provocative act, was noted with disgust and indignation. The writers of Soviet Georgia condemned and repudiated Pavliashvili traitorous work in the strongest possible terms, and his name will be mentioned with the unbounded hatred alongside the names of all of the lying traitors of the double crosses of our homeland. Just kind of letting just it should sink in. So disgusting. I want to take a shower again. Ugh. Yeah. So, to the left-hand side from here, but there are also some photographs of other people arrested in 37, 38, protocols of their interrogations, and also obviously the verdicts. These are all copies. They are provided here. There was an interesting man, Rodion Korkia. Just kind of just for you to understand how scared to death people were. Rodion Korkia kept having his diary. He had this diary for his entire life. And when 1937 came, he burned his diary and started writing a diary that he would backdate 1936, 1935, 1936, 1937. And in that new diary that he had created, he would be praising Stalin, Soviet values, criticizing his fellow, colleagues that had been accused, suspected, or recognized as enemies of people, and so on and so forth. So Rodion Korkia, he did that systematically, very consistently. Well, unfortunately, that didn't help him. He was denounced, well, on some, it's just some, you know. These are the names of the poets, writers, men and women that, but mostly men, that were persecuted, arrested, and many of them were executed by the Soviets in just 1937, 1938. Speaking of Grigol Robakidze, well, yeah, he was the one who defected, right? And the one who worked closely with the government of the independent Georgian Republic in exile. Like many white emigre, and I'm saying white immigrant, not just this doesn't only apply to the monarchists from Russia proper, but also everyone who were against the Red Army, against the Bolsheviks. I just call them white immigrant. He, like many white immigrant, like a lot of anti-Bolsheviks in Europe, Grigor Bakidze, for some reason, thought that when Hitler came to power and when they invaded Poland, well, in 1939, he thought, and many other, like-minded people supported Hitler. And this is public knowledge. You can find this information anywhere. I'm not imagining things. Supported Hitler, supported his invasion of Soviet Union, supported his attack on the Soviet Union, because they genuinely thought that Hitler would see with favor the independence of Georgia. So enemy of my enemy is my friend. And a lot of Russians thought the same way. We don't know what Grigol Bakidze thought about the Jews. We don't know that, but we know that he was connected to the German government on a very high level. And he was living in Paris, and Paris was under occupation. Hitler was very frequent there. And so it goes without saying, he supported Hitler, and he was hoping he was just hoping that because his only hope was that Hitler would be the one to actually get rid of Stalin. That was the thing. Also, other big writers of Georgia thought so, such as Alexander Asatiani, for example. Alexander Asatiani also worked closely with the Nazis in the occupied Paris mostly. And he even proposed to Hitler the idea that the monarchy in Georgia could be restored. And he was willing to give the government of the country to Prince Irakli Bagrationi, who was, the prince in exile. We don't really know what Hitler thought about it, but it's highly unlikely Hitler will be okay with it. And by the way, so this information was passed on to Hitler through the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Ribbentrop. So it was all discussed at the highest possible level. Okay? So just saying. Or there was, for example, another writer, Ahmed Ali. Well, he was a scholar. He was a philosopher and scholar, just a big intellectual, also friend with a lot of Georgian writers. So he traveled to Germany during still the independent period of Georgia, and stayed in Europe. And he got a very good education, and he was a very well-respected scholar. And Ahmed Ali, so Mikhail Ahmed Ali, he was an advisor on the Caucasus for Alfred Rosenberg, who was the leader of the, let's say, ideological, who was in charge of, let's say, ideological policies of Hitler's Germany. So these people worked with the Nazis, cooperated with the Nazis. But again, I highly doubt it had anything to do, let's say, with the hate for Jews, or, it wasn't about nationalism, right? It was just about thinking that the enemy of my enemy, could help me get rid of Stalin, and Georgia would be back to normal, and we would enjoy our monarchy again and live just happily ever after. Hitler would have never let that happen. Absolutely. And why they were interested in Caucasus? Because there was oil in Azerbaijan, and because there was the Black Sea, and because there was a way to, well, there were pipelines that had been left by the nobles, and that's the story. So during the Second World War times, many Georgians had to go to war, but they didn't want to be. They were conscripted. But they didn't want to go because they didn't feel like it was their war. They didn't feel it, like, at all. They didn't want to fight for the Russian people. Let's say that's what they thought, right? Because the Russians were oppressors. So why did they want to sacrifice their own lives? I'm just kind of sharing with you the narrative, which, again, one can understand, absolutely. And also a lot of writers and many of them were actually young writers as well, that just had to go to war because they were still of the right age and everything. So some people obviously would desert. They didn't want to go. Some people would die. Some people would stay in Europe. Well, just desert and stay in Europe. And there was also, among the intellectuals, a so-called of, we're almost done. I'm just kind of almost finishing. Please forgive me. I know I'm running. It was kind of the postgraduate insurgents, or postgraduates case, so-called. So the students and also the teachers, the professors of Javakishvili, well, now it's called Javakishvili, Tbilisi State University, they tried to work closely with the opposition, and they tried to undermine the activity of the Bolsheviks. They were arrested and persecuted. Arrested and persecuted. There were a lot of spies that were integrated in those secret communities. And, well, that didn't really help much, unfortunately. And a lot of people were killed. A lot of people. This is just a photo of one of the poets on the grave of the fellow member, just like that. Women as well. So, well, for example, the only woman poet who was punished for her patriotic lyrics and for publishing a handwritten journal, Anathema, she was arrested in March 1945, spent 1 year in the internal prison of NK, but almost like NKVD, and 1946 was sentenced to exile to Vyatka labor camp for 6 years. So, and even if these people were not executed, they would be sent to labor camps, which basically meant the same thing. They didn't necessarily have to plant bombs, right, to literally undermine the Soviet regime. It wasn't about that. It didn't have to be that. It had to be, distribution of some anti-patriotic literature, anti-Bolshevik literature and things like that, because people tried to do whatever they could. But anyway, so Chabua Amirajebi was the one who even was the person in charge of an organization that was called the Tetri Georgi, like White Georgi organization. It was actually like a group of nationalists, a totally anti-Soviet organization. And this organization, by the way, it was founded in 1924. So when in August that very big revolt was oppressed, the people somehow were able to, well, to do some sort of activity throughout all those years. Just imagine. And so the Tetra Georgi was one of the strongest organizations that cooperated also with the government in exile. They arranged all sort of sabotage and mutinies also in the front line uh, and within the country. And it whoever was caught and found somehow connected to the activity of the White Georgi, Tetri Georgi organizations, well, those people were killed almost immediately, almost without any trial, like at all. Maria Abramishvili was not directly connected to this group, but it's highly likely that she was among those who were involved with all these in all the activities. After the cancellation of the cult of Stalin, obviously things started to change. It was a little easier. The criticism of Stalin in Georgia was not allowed yet, but at least the control and the screws were not as tight as it used to be. And Georgians were given a bit more freedom. Georgians were also able to maintain the status of Georgian language as their official, as a state language as well, alongside with Russian, which was a big deal. But yes, in general, basically it still remained under control of the party until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, so let me open the chat. I know this abundance of names that you've never heard of. It's not easy. I can relate. I understand. And again, I'm not attempting to I'm not saying I'm giving you a lecture on Georgian literature, on poignant, Georgian literature and attempts to, fight the Soviets. I'm just giving you, at least some stories. I just want also to bring the name of some of those people. I think it's just something that would be interesting to know. Plus, it was interesting for me to learn this because it's also part of my history anyway. And many of you have done so many tours with me on Russian Revolution, and many of you are just interested in how the Soviet machine was able to work and was able to be just as efficient and as scary and merciless, equally merciless, both in Moscow, Leningrad, and thousands of miles away in the Caucasus. I've opened the chat. Let me know if you have any questions. And in 16 minutes from now, Misha and I will be giving a talk on Bastard and Margarita. So Mikhail Bulgakov. Can't wait. To be honest, just can't wait. And it's going to be, in 15 minutes. And then after 1 hour, I'm going to be taking to the German colony of Jerusalem. Also to the Protestant cemetery there, which is very difficult to access. It's usually closed, so I was able to get there once. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope my connectivity has been okay, well, more or less at least. And hi to all those who joined us a little after we started. Ellen, Emily, nice to see you. Catherine. Well, Mari, I think I said hi. I think you joined just before I started. Let him throw the first stone. Thank you so much. Yeah, exactly. So Maria, coming from the post-Soviet world, she can relate. So I can relate. Even though I was born in 1987, I was kind of still born in the Soviet Union. Obviously, I didn't see all those atrocities, but I saw what the life was like after that. And Georgia also went through a very difficult period of time after the collapse of the Soviet Empire as well, the Civil War. Yes, the next talk, Ellen, is in 15 minutes exactly. I've kind of overrun by 15 minutes. I'm so sorry. It's time to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. I would appreciate your support. You can send a PayPal donation. You could buy me a coffee. Please don't buy me wine. And speaking of wine and speaking of cheese and everything else, let me just once again, for those who missed my epic live streams from the antique bookstore, the antique store with some 18th and 19th century porcelain. And if you missed me getting drunk live on the wine festival, but it was all actually very nicely done. I got drunk in a very elegant way. I think so. Don't tell me if I'm wrong, please, because I just rather think that I did. Ignorance is bliss. The one tour yesterday was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alan. It's very sweet of you. So now I'm going to have a little bit of the cheese that I bought from the market like a couple of hours ago. And well, Misha and I will be giving a talk on Master and Margarita. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you very soon. And thank you for joining. You weren't drunk, you were tipsy. Well, yeah, but I was more tipsier than I had ever been in my life before. Yes, I know full well that my late father had such friendly conversations more than once. Exactly. All these, yeah, friendly conversations we know. Yeah, yeah. You were happy. I was enjoying myself, and I'm really happy that I've been able to take you with me. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye.